Okay, just wait for colleagues to join us. So, we're at the end of our day, and I think we've got, hopefully got people joining us remotely, but even if they don't, we will try to include people, and we I think should try to sum up and shape where we think the debate has moved to. And you will recall at the outset, you know, we wanted to move the discussion in post-liberalism forward, which I think irrefutably we've done. We are going to do a book of the presentation, so there will be essays to preserve and repeat and distribute. So more of that shortly. So Aris has communicated to me that he's not able to do it. So so it's us. So we'll make this a full discussion. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have Danny Kruger here, who's an academic in his own right, who wrote a brilliant book on fraternity that I can recall reading. And when I read it, I was like, God, this thought is brilliant. I must meet him. And I did indeed go in and met, and we've been friends for over a decade now, ever since your wonderful book on fraternity, which I would encourage you all to get and read. Okay, without further ado, Danny Kruger, MP, one of the most interesting and intellectually profound MPs in the House, and I'm thrilled he's there. Danny.
Great, thanks. Well, it's just us between you and a drink, so I'm going to do this snappily. Or let's just see how it goes. It's been the most brilliant day. I've enjoyed every single talk and conversation. I'm really grateful to have been included and very, very pleased to have come. And I just had a few reflections on the conversation, and you know, very happy if the conversation gets underway to talk a bit more about the British political scene and situation. But my reflections are, so I thought the conversation between Philip and Matt about liberty or liberalism was instructive, but ultimately we are in the same place, I think, which is whether we call it liberalism or liberty before liberalism. I agree with Matt that there is this idea of the mater familias, the sort of governing idea of our civilization deriving from Christianity, is at least in part sourced from the idea that every individual has unique value and worth, and indeed an identity that's distinct from their tribe or their family or their human community, that they're children of God and they have a unique identity there. And it's from there that our liberalism or our liberties descend. And I was also remembering Roger Scruton's definition of conservatism as a pause within that liberal tradition, and a recognition of how it can be perverted, and how our job is to manage the evolution of this idea of the unique value of the individual, and to ensure that our native sinfulness is mitigated by the institutions in which we grow up and are accommodated. And if we think that liberalism, however we define it, or whatever term we use, but this idea is in a sense the motive force of our society, we also recognise how it can go wrong, and as we've been discussing, how it can easily be aggrandised by the institutions of power. And I just think about what's been happening in the last couple of years, and is happening right now. The COVID crisis both reinforced or helped us recover some of the good things that we think of as inherent in our society, real sense of family obligations. People, as it were, retreated to the oikos during COVID. They also supported the power oikos, the parish, beyond the household through neighbourhood support groups which sprung up. So we saw, as it were, the best of society, but we also saw and see and are threatened by the aggrandizing impulse of the state, and of the biostate in particular, a state which wants to know a lot about our health and our bodies. And there's a danger of big government, big business, building on pandemics and on health crises. And interestingly, we haven't debated much the whole question around COVID and what it means for Western conservatism and liberalism. I think if Mary Harrington was here, we'd be having that conversation. But I'm interested in how many post-liberals are concerned about what the government got up to and what governments around the world. I mean, the British government was pretty good by Western standards. But we should, I think, have a thought for for what Western governments have done during COVID. And the other great event of our time, of course, is Ukraine. And here again, we see the necessary return of realism in our politics, the sort of fantasy politics of the last generation, post-Cold War era, when we thought we could make the world just as we want it to be. And if we pretend everyone should get along, they will. We have abandoned that. But there is, of course, the parallel risk that that the response to this new realism will be a reinforced globalism and an expectation that all countries must unite, as they must, against Russian aggression, but form grand new alliances which actually repress the sovereignty of nations. And I think the conversation about nations and empires has been fascinating. But I think even Philip wouldn't think that the nation should have total sovereignty. The empire should have total sovereignty. We need some subsidiarity. So just a word on the sort of these cultural questions, cultural wars. I mean, somebody, I think Eric was pointing out how conservatives in the UK don't seem to be engaging in these questions, and I recognise the charge and I accept it to a degree. Of course, my party is very conscious of the culture war, of the threats and the electoral opportunities that it presents. I think we're distracted with what I think of as skirmishes in the culture war. Conflicts over statues, over the small boats crossing the English Channel. These are very important matters. Illegal immigration, the risk that migrants are taking, these things matter significantly. Statues matter too, flags matter. But they don't matter as much as the deeper conversation that we've been having today, the structural, or the kind of intellectual structures of our conflict. And we are in a religious war, it strikes me. And James put it beautifully. I couldn't note it down, but anyway, glorious paragraph in his talk about the sort of medieval religiosity of this conflict. And it is a war between those who have an idea of the right way to be human, that there is a right way to be human, as Milbank put it, and those who think there is no right way to be human except how you want it to be. And you can be who you want, and there is no objective idea of the good. One side and one part of the of that latter group are vicious. I mean, it is proper kind of 17th century, burning that we see. But mostly, it's more sort of 19th century. What J.S. Mill objected to, the kind of social tyranny of and the religiosity of the of this mindset, and we need to resist it. And why have we got it? I think partly it's, as it were, conservatives' fault. There has undoubtedly been injustice and social tyranny on the other side. What Mill himself was objecting to, a sort of intolerant conservatism. Remember the revolution always takes the character of the ancien regime. So there has been a counter-reaction, and I think we should acknowledge among conservatives that we partly brought this upon ourselves. But that isn't the real source of the problem. The source of the problem is, as Eric was saying, this is baked in to the rising generation, And I agree with many of the previous speakers. Ultimately, this is a consequence of our rejection of God. And if you don't accept that there is sin in the world, you don't think there should be forgiveness either. And the intolerance that we see is the consequence. So to the end, final point, how do we get out of this? Well, as in the 16th century, I think one side has to win. Elizabeth I was not trying to achieve a compromise, but when she won, she brought about a settlement, and she accommodated her defeated opponents to some degree under some measure of toleration, and she also repudiated the more extreme versions of her own, adherents on her side, the Puritans. But there was no question about some sort of hybrid end to those religious conflicts. There had to be an established religion. What is that for us? I think it should be the procedural liberalism that Eric was talking about, with a sort of freedom of worship for minority faiths, the wokai. But they must not be allowed to occupy the heights of the culture and the institutions. But mostly what we need to do is to give young people the belonging and opportunities for activism, which at the moment is being channeled into this crazy politics. And that is, I think, ultimately a conservative mission about building the institutions which give people belonging, opportunities for activism, a sense of who they are. Which brings me to the point to where we were earlier with Rab Butler. So possibly we need a federation of youth, but certainly we need those sorts of institutions that basically will keep people busy and induct them into the civilization that they're heirs to, rather than allowing them to trash it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Danny. John, your reflections on the day and your takeaway, please.
Thank you very much. Well, of course, if I gave away my full takeaway, it would be here for some hours, because this has been an absolutely fascinating day. It's been very rich in the insights into a whole range of issues. So I'm just going to cherry pick a few of them and give a response. The first point would be, I want to discuss your notion of empire and nation and where it fits into this. Secondly, so you may have to remind me of what I said I'm going to talk about. So the second one thing I want to discuss is the Conservative Party's record in reconciling apparently divergent situations. I want to point out when I think both the decline of a certain kind of conservative began Mrs. Thatcher's defenestration, and why, and I want to also say why I think in reaction to that and when the beginnings of post-liberalism could be seen. And finally, we haven't talked about sex much, I think, but at the same time, that's obviously an area in which is suffering from the woke revolution tremendously, and which, as far as I can see, post-liberalism hasn't really come up with a distinctive response to it. Now, so first of all, if I can remember what the first one was, yes, empire and nation. I don't feel myself competent to discuss some aspects of this question, but I must ask you, Philip, presumably you are not talking, when you talk of empire, are you talking more of civilization rather than the political organization of an empire?
I'm certainly talking about civilization, but the nature of civilizations is that they have to be defended, or otherwise they're attacked. So what there isn't in human history is peace without that act of defense. And if you look at the constitutions of civilizations or empires, there is no civilization that is not also an empire. Would be my thesis, and in the long paper I wrote for which I'm happy to share with anyone, for the journal Pro Bono, I went to the example of the Greek city-states. So normally people go to the Greek city-states because they think, oh, there's a stable ancient polity. But actually, it was never stable. All of the entities were imperial, all were involved in extreme war. About just over 42 city-states were actually annihilated during these long centuries. We had the rise of Sparta. Sparta won the Peloponnesian War because it was in conflict with the Athenian Empire that rose to threaten with it, but it lacked the scale to dominate the Mediterranean. All were responding in part to the incursion of the Persian Empire. And what we see in human history is there is no intermediate state. There is tribe, chieftainate, and then petty states that themselves tend to form empires to defend against other incursion empires. And once you move beyond tribe, you're in the logic of civilization and empire. And if we go to the modern period, so there is nothing in human history, I would argue, that is beyond tribe, that is outside of that logic. And then you go to the breakup of empires and the constitution of modern nation states. They are only maintained as modern nation states by their alliance with other empires. So what I wanted to say is we can give it a more comfortable frame, if you like, but there's very good history. John Darwin's books have been superb in sort of making this basic point. Is there a fundamental constituent of human life and the defense of human life? And what we found, and I'd argue recent history has told us this, is there is no defense of the nation state outside of empire. And if you're just a nation state, you're going to get picked off. So you could call it civilization, but sorry, John, complexify the point. This doesn't mean I'm in favor of terrible empires doing terrible things to people. What I think the world that we're in is we need to make qualitative social and political judgments about what form of affiliation we have. So I'm somewhat appalled by my American friends, and they are my friends, who then suddenly, published the article in the New York Times and said, no more foreign wars, American isolationism, that is an opt-out from history, which is a common American response to opt out from history, that is not possible to do or conduct. The really interesting question is there's no opt-out from globalization either. But by the same token, we don't have to be ruled by a global liberalism. There are other options open to us for the polities we form to defend one another. And so I'm a great believer in the West, loosely thought. I also believe in subsidiarity for the nation, as colleagues and friends have said. I think that the work by Peter Jones on the Austro-Hungarian on the Holy Roman Empire is superb as an example of how you can have a polity that lasts over 1,000 years and is deeply federal, where nobody is able to enforce authorities against anyone else, and where it secures relative peace. So what I'm saying in the realm of beyond, I basically want liberalism to stop the fetishization of ethnocentric nationalism. Okay. Either on a civic, I think that's a disastrous mistake, especially when we face something as evil as a revanchist Russia, and even worse, China. There is no option for the defense of the West other than the West defending the West, right? Right. On whatever polity we construct. And that, I am making, in a way, a realist claim. And I'm also making a counter-nationalist claim. And I most want to free post-liberalism from its taint of nationalism and ethnocentrism.
Well, I think the taint of nationalism is something I'm now going to defend and argue, of course, that it doesn't deserve the word taint. And I would begin by saying, of course, I do not believe in any theoretically pure system of states. I think that states and empires both emerge from history on all sorts of different principles. If I'm going to go very big picture, I would say that when empires emerge from, in a sense, aggressive wars or by marriage as the Habsburg empires advanced, then what you will get is a multinational empire, which in the course of being built is often full of wars and injustice and conflict. It then achieves a certain stability, and it then deserves the marvelous description of the Roman Empire by Gibbon, that a naked virgin with a bag of gold could walk from Gaul all the way to Syria and be completely safe from any attack. So and by the way, I share your admiration for the British Empire very strongly, and I think that its current reputation intellectually in the world is absurd and shameful that we allow it to be traduced so often. Now, equally, when when empires begin to decline for whatever reason, then you have another period of disorder, and then some new settlement occurs. Now, what do I therefore think should be the aim of politics? Well, we have to deal with any situation in front of us. In this case, I would say, I believe that we should accept and welcome the transformation of empire into nation states. Now, the nation states need not be purely ethnic ones. I mean, obviously, the British Isles are not a pure ethnic state and shouldn't be. And at the same time, you probably do need, I think, a substantial ethnic majority in any state, rather than 3 or 4 nations of approximately equal weight and population, because then you have as witnesses like Lee Kuan Yew have said, once you have a multicultural society, you have politics turns on ethnic loyalties. And we need to avoid that if we possibly can. Now, what do I think is the ideal arrangement? I think the ideal arrangement in which a nation state can and should exist is internationalism. Internationalism couldn't exist without nationalism, or at least without nation states. That's what it is. It's cooperative. Therefore, the situation of the modern world until after the Second World War, about 1960, was one in which internationalism was, so to speak, the logical consequence of different nations. Now, the emergence of the EU as not an internationalist, but a transnational or a supranational state, or rather polity tending towards statehood, towards empire. Now it's some of its advocates proclaim. That is, it seems to me, incompatible with democracy. The moment an empire begins to try to be democratic, it has to deal with the fact that its constituent states, or tribes, or whatever you want to call them, have different interests, different economic interests, different political values, and so on. And it will tend to be turbulent, as Austria-Hungary was, or it will tend to appease the local states until they become states themselves. And then you have the opportunities for internationalism. So what democracy really does need a nation state, need a state, probably one with an ethnic majority, but certainly not one that is absolutely evenly divided, in which all political conflict then becomes ethnic. So that's what I would argue is, in a sense, the best world approximation of a decent society. And I certainly believe that democracy does not seem to work outside that context. Yeah. There are one or two cases which seem to run counter to that. Switzerland is one, but there were civil wars in the 19th century, and another would be India, but there are frequent ethnic disturbances.
The trouble is you can't opt out of the civilizational project. There isn't a nice little cul-de-sac into which you can turn And when you go out of the cul-de-sac, it's nationalism. But when you go in, it's kind of you and your people. If you are just discrete nation states, you will be picked off by other empires. It's just as simple as that. And there is no historical opt-out from that. If you want to defend your particularity, you have no choice but to bind yourself into treaty organizations that become quasi-empires, which indeed is what the West is, and it's what the EU is. And it has always been thus. So I think it's just in no way true that you can have peaceful nation states, because they have never been in human time. You might have a brief hiatus secured, but it always drifts. And what you actually have without empire is a permanent war of all against all. And what you do get with empire is the longevity of peace that it manages to secure. And there's different ways to secure those empires. You're quite right. You can have, it's either by conquest or by agreement. But there's all sorts of history of, as in a way, empires by agreement, which is what the EU is. So I'm not trying to defend the EU, but what I'm trying to say is that it's exactly the formation I'm talking about. And I think it's specious to pretend there's any other option, because historically there just isn't.
Well, I think the better term for what you want, and what I certainly would find more than acceptable, a good thing, is civilization. And by that I mean a set of common agreements generally accepted by almost all states in it, and common sympathies arising out of that, which means that they tend to band together, sometimes by treaty, but sometimes by the occasion of the moment, to assist each other. We know also, unfortunately, from our experience since the First World War, that collective security is not to be relied on, and sometimes the security we then reattain is by alliance with countries who are from the other empire, but which simply have common interests in defeating an aggressive
But as soon as, I agree with you, but as soon as you have that, you have to have military alliance, and you do have military alliance to defend it. But let's open up to people in the audience.
May I just say that I'm going to make a few other points, that was only my first point, but you hijacked it, if I may say so.
Empires, civilization.
Empires are jealous.
Go on, go on, John. Sorry.
That's okay. Now, what was the next point I was going to talk about? Oh, well, the second one I'm going to choose is this. When I left working for Mrs. T and went to edit NR in America, they asked me to come back every now and then, help on speeches, which I did. When I came back, of course, I went to see all my old friends in politics, was invited out to dinner, lunches, and so on. Had lots of good times. And I found that the men in Mrs. Thatcher's government, to some extent, to a considerable extent, and their wives to a great extent, were really fed up with Mrs. Thatcher. Now, obviously, their husbands' ambitions played a part in that, or their ambitions for their husband. But there was something else. And it was, the table conversation was, of course, we're doing tremendously well as in economics, and that's because of economic liberalism. We've realized the value of that. Where we're still lagging is social conservatism, social liberalism. There was undoubtedly at the top of the Conservative Party towards the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, there was this feeling that we were missing a kind of civilizational bus. Well, I didn't agree with that and had arguments about it, but nonetheless, I discovered that was the spirit. And then I remember having a debate with Alan Duncan. And Alan was urging, and you will recognize this from your picture of the way in which the people who believe in free trade, so to speak, trying to impose that as the only possible Brexit. But Alan was saying it's absolutely essential we get rid of these people like Anne Widdecombe, who are simply discrediting us with all sensible people. And I remember saying to him, look at the relative voting power of the FDP, which represents you, Alan, in Germany, and the CDU. The FDP sometimes doesn't even get 5%. That's a social and economic liberalism party. The Conservatives, the CDU, is fundamentally a conservative party, and it gets 40%, 45%. And the Conservative Party the leading figures just refused to accept that. And when Mrs. Thatcher was replaced by John Major, John Gray he was moving perhaps already, but it was Major who really moved him out of the party. And his description of Majorism was, it's Thatcherism on autopilot. By which he meant it was economic liberalism detached from patriotism, from a strong presence in the world. So my own view is, of course, that was the beginning of a certain kind of end for the Conservative Party. Now, when did that begin to change? I first noticed that in Australia. Tony Abbott wrote a book called Battleground prior to his winning the landslide in 2010. In that election, his battleground argument was, look, the family does a job for society. It conceives and gives birth to children, and it then educates them. We don't pay families for this, and we've got to find a way of giving the credit to the parents in economic terms. That's absolutely the big point in which he differed from previous liberal parties. He also passed the Brian Loughnane test, which you've probably never heard of. The Loughnane test is Conservative Party, the Liberal Party in Australia, which is conservative and liberal, it wins elections when its leader, the leader of the party, is also the leader of the conservative movement in Australian society. When they're two different people, it loses elections. And in fact, that was more than proved by the fact that when Tony won an election on this platform, I was telling you, in a sense, the remuneration for the family for what it does, he won with a landslide. When he was turfed out by the mixture of corporate Australia and the left of the party, and Malcolm Turnbull went in, he lost virtually every seat and just held, every seat of his majority, and just held on. Why was that? It was because he was, in a way, the media and left-wing opinion managed to install a card-carrying social liberal as the head of the Liberal Party, and that doomed them. So I think that you could see this. Now, I think the second of those events was followed on directly from the first. The Conservative Party was notably directionless, and I don't think David Cameron solved that problem, really, because he wasn't prepared to take on the culture of The Guardian and the BBC. I think he had many other good elements. And incidentally, when he was imposing austerity, or George, or the Chancellor was, that austerity was the demand of the entire establishment in 2010. If you look back at it, Alistair Darling's budget was more austere than the Tory budget. So it wasn't possible for the Tories, in a sense, to follow a policy of, so to speak, social transformation of a moral kind, when it was absolutely devoted to, and forced by opinion to be devoted to, economic salvation. So my own feeling is that what you've latched onto, quicker than me, by the way, I will concede. No, I should say I will conceal. I should have concealed it. What you've latched onto is the fact that the conservative spirit in Britain has always had several wings. That, in a technical sense, a boring technical sense, some of their views are strictly incompatible. The individualists on the one hand, the imperialists on the other, the classical liberals, and the corporate interests, and finally people who just like things the way they are, or the social conservatives. They ought to be more quarrelsome than they are. Why aren't they? Well, they're in the same party. They meet each other all the time. Your arguments with people you've never met are much harder and harsher than people whom you know, who you have a drink with at the end of a party meeting. And as someone who spent, as I say, 4 years in Swinton College, the little think tank of the Conservative Party, I think I met every Conservative activist in those 4 years. And there were violent disagreements, but they never had any sense that they couldn't go along with policies that were the reward for another wing of the party. And that's why I think one of the many reasons why two-party systems are more stable. I should probably stop at that point. Just throwing to you, Philip, what do we say about does post-liberalism have to say about gender theory, but more particularly about the extraordinary divisions now about sexual politics on the left? I think that there are very few principled liberals, J.K. Rowling is one, who are willing to take a stand. But we have to say something because we represent, I think, the opinions of the great majority of the people. And that means we have to embrace a realistic and decent feminism on the one hand, but we also have to find out how it is that men and women, who, after all, the future of the world does depend on, are going to be able to get together and stay together. And I don't think, are you saying anything distinctive? Are we saying anything distinctive about this?
Well, I think you asked the right question, and I think a socially liberal party can't do it. But we're not just a socially liberal party, and I think it's important that we essentially challenge extremist minority politics that aren't even followed by the minorities that they claim to represent. It's important we allow the normative to prevail, not to persecute minorities. Minorities need protecting and nurturing, but we can't allow them to define what majorities could and should be. It's fundamentally unjust and undemocratic. And so for a socially liberal party, we'll have to learn that social conservatism isn't reactionary. I always say I'm a social conservationist rather than conservative to avoid the pejorative. So I'm not anti-gay, I'm not anti-anybody, but I do believe in conserving majority structures and allowing minorities access to them in a just way. And I think that's certainly one thing we have to do. So let's open this up to colleagues. Chris had a question. Oh, sorry. Andrea, you save us all. So undoubtedly you're going to heaven. I've been told.
I didn't realise that was within your power, Philip. But now that I do,
it's subsidiarity of a theological sort.
So the more I hear you and John discussing empire, the more I realise that what you're talking about is what in international relations theory is called international society, and they've used that term because IR theory reinvents the wheel, and by the time it discovers something that everybody's already known, the language has gone out of fashion. So that's why it's called international society rather than civilization. But I think your project is an interesting one, which is exposing the Christian presuppositions of international society, theories of international relations, or even arguing that those should be beefed up and that there's a more important or credible version of international relations, international society, the IR theory mainstream, because it's positivistic, ignores. And I think that would be a really interesting project. So one of our colleagues at Hull, Justin Morris, is very much in this tradition. Tim Dunn, Steve Smith, who used to be the Vice-Chancellor of Exeter, Nick Wheeler, and this is actually the English school position. It's quite mainstream, and I think packaging it as empire invites the wrong kind of presuppositional prejudice about what you're advocating. And what you're advocating is a Christian notion of the international society, and I don't think that's controversial. What was my second question about? I can't remember.
Can I answer that? So I would resist the reduction to international society. I'm not saying it's reductive, because I think it's less cosmopolitan than that suggests. we're in Huntington's world, I think. We're in Clash of Civilizations. We're in civilizational blocks, clearly and explicitly so. I've been reading Putin for a while, and I read his latest missive where he said the Ukrainians are one people. And I put it on Twitter. I said, I think he's going to invade. Because with Dubček and his kind of quasi-mystical kind of absolutist theology, he's engaged in a civilizational project, undoubtedly. The Chinese are. The Chinese are completely explicit that theirs is a civilizational project in conflict with ours. And the history of the West has historically been an ideational, civilizational project. And guess what? Liberalism is a civilizational, ideational project. So I think it's much more conflictual than people would like to allow. And the attempt to elide conflictual relations is just an attempt to assume that others are like you when they're not. And I think they're not. I would defend the use of empire because I think it's more historically exact, because it brings together things that civilization doesn't, which is it needs military defense. It has a necessary imperial element, and it needs to be able to defend itself to survive. And civilization doesn't carry that. And so I think the use of the term is not meant to unnecessarily engender reaction. I think it's necessarily engendering reaction because I think it's more exact and more descriptive of what's going on. Anyway, that's just...
I remembered my second question, or comment, which is in response to Danny. I think what you say, Danny, is exactly right about young people finding places in institutions in which they belong, finding belonging in real communities rather than online communities. The life of the screen is a poor substitute for that. Sir Roger wrote about this a lot in Where We Are. But for me, what Conservatives can do about that is really a question of what is it that's preventing or impeding existing institutions from recruiting young people in the way that they once did? You know, what is it that's blocking that? And actually, this is a bit of a liberal position on institutional replenishment, seeking to diffuse the liberties that institutions provide more rapidly into among other members. And I think that's the basic question. How do we help our civic associations to replenish themselves with the young more easily? And why aren't they doing it at the moment? What's stopping them?
Thanks. Civil society has been, attenuated by economic forces and official neglect for all my life. All my life, people have been saying, what's happened to the youth clubs? And there presumably was no golden age when there was youth clubs on every corner, but certainly just the same trend that has hollowed out the high street has removed many of the activities that young people had available to them, and they're now entertained, in their bedrooms. And obviously, if you remember the sort of moral panic of the 90s, which was a legitimate moral panic, soaring rates of antisocial behaviour, teenage pregnancy, drug addiction, joyriding, all disappeared as the internet came in, because suddenly kids could get their kicks at home, and so they're safer, but they're going mad. And they're unhappier. So the answer is, as you say, to refound the institutions of belonging. I mean, I have a simple solution, which is, it's not a simple solution, but it's simply put, which is we need to make use of young people. And we need them to take up their roles as young people historically did, as the pioneers, the risk takers of our generation. And what we have at the moment is this stretched adolescence that starts ever earlier and finishes ever later. It used to be a year or so rite of passage from childhood to adulthood. Now it lasts 10 years or more. It stretches way into people's 20s. and we need to actually put young people to use. And I think we need a new economics of that, which we could and should do by using the budgets that go into further and higher education and welfare, as well as the various schemes which do exist for youth services, and properly invigorate the civil society institutions. I mean, I think Rab Butler's example that we were hearing about earlier is instructive. I don't think we should be creating some major new single institution, but I think we can make use of existing ones and or allow people to found them, and put young people to work, which is what they want to do. And there's so much needs to be done in our society. Looking after younger children, looking after the environment, replanting the hedgerows, cleaning up the rivers, reforesting, and as well as all sorts of social activities that need to be done, as well as training, education, socialization. But we need a framework for this, and that's, I think, a job for civil society rather than for government. But we can put the framework in place for that.
Can I come in on the clash of civilizations briefly? The problem which we would have to face in dealing with the other countries is, of course, there are international institutions which have been shaped by Western liberalism, spoiled Christianity, and the rest of the world has had to go along with them. And now, of course, they don't want to. The question is, what are they going to propose? Well, what you have is, of course, in China, certainly you have this civilizational project. It's a confused one because it's a blend of Western Marxism, transfigured, and Confucianism, and so on. So that's one. The other is increasingly an Indian, Hindu-influenced Indian, not ethnocentrism, but focused more on Hindu beliefs than on Indian interests and so on. Now, this issue came up some years ago in an interesting way. Faced with the fact that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was inconsistent with some of the tenets of Islam, the Islamic world actually had a serious conference in which jurists tried to produce their own version of the Declaration of Human Rights, which they said candidly at the beginning was going to be different from the United Nations one of 48, I think. And it was. Now, it was, however, I thought a lot of people scoffed at it, but I was very impressed by it. First of all, it took the idea of human rights seriously. Secondly, had it been implemented generally, human rights, particularly of women, would have been improved, not to the level which we would urge, but they would have been improved. And thirdly, it was a serious attempt to say to us, let's get together and discuss what we can do. Now, obviously, the next stage, if this had, in a sense, taken root, which I don't think it did, it was for a while, it would have been for jurists from different civilizations to get together and try to see if there was something that could be presented as a genuinely universal Declaration of Human Rights. My feeling would be, if that had been achieved, it would have been full of codicils and footnotes exempting particular points. But this was a project that, although it was very difficult and hasn't proceeded all that well, nonetheless was an attempt on all sides to avoid future conflicts. And I think, it would be have your approval, Philip. And I would say it had one clear good sign, which is the Ken Minogue argument, in which he says, if we were to advance to the rest of the world in the West and say, we're the Christian world, we're maybe secular now, but these are our principles and they derived ultimately from Christianity or some from the Enlightenment. The rest of the world would be more willing to talk to us than if we present our cultural backgrounds as being the basis for their world. I think that's something we might move towards.
I think that's very astute, and I agree. So we're in a world of civilizational blocks, but that doesn't necessitate civilizational conflict. It doesn't necessarily flow, though I think it will, right? what's really interesting is if you look at the great Islamic, Jewish, and Christian debates of the Middle Ages. So if you actually look at religion, I think religion is primary. It's the primary form of ideation. And if you look at the political divides in our world, they all map pretty much exactly on religious divides. So that's an interesting, all our divides are ultimately religious in the current worldview, which then means that China, for instance, becoming the world's most populous Christian country is a matter of geopolitical importance. The trouble is, in some sense, that the type of Christianity that will become dominant in China is a sort of individualist Protestant evangelical, because the Catholic Church can't organize in China as successfully as Protestant evangelicals, because they organize through house churches, and Catholicism struggles with that. So China will become a dominant second largest, then largest Christian country, and that is transitional of the first order. But back to the point of the Middle Ages, Jews and Muslims and Christians, and a lot of them, remember, the Muslim thinkers were conversio Jews. They talked to each other when they recognized they were discussing the same universal. So they discussed the nature of God, because they all agreed there was a God. And they discussed his nature. So the last great interaction between the faiths is around the nature of God. That's when you have Mendelssohn and so on and so forth. And that is also a possibility for a post-liberal internationalism around civilizations, which is to say we have a universal, you have a universal, in some sense they're shared, let's discern. And I particularly like your account. What you should do, I think, in civilizational dialogue, because you don't want to get into killing, because it's awful, right? What you should do is exactly what you suggest. Say, these are our principles, and this is what we derive from them, rather than anything else. And that is the world where I think you could shape out an alternate model. Because remember, the liberal model is imperialist in the wrong sense. It says, if you're not like me, you're not valuable. We're going to go to war with your culture because you treat women differently. We might think how they treat women differently is indeed wrong, but it's not legitimation for war. So this is the level at which I think, as post-liberals, we need to move the debate forward. And if we don't, if we remain trapped at the level of the nation and of national defense, we'll get into positions that I think are untenable, where our American Catholic friends are, which is saying we're not going to act against evil, right? We're not going to act for the universal ethic, and they're meant to be Christians, and this is untenable. We will lose against liberalism in that world. And so I think that this is we've got to, I think you're right, I'm not against the nation, of course, and rights accrue, and we've got to start discussing ways in which we can be more idealistic than our enemies. And that's what will attract the young, because if post-liberalism becomes the possession of white males over a certain age, and there aren't enough women here, and yet our offer to women is far better than the liberal offer, that's odd, isn't it? That's really odd. You know, this is the task for us as post-liberals, is to become truly idealistic and more visionary than our enemies. Sorry, Ferenc, then Dan and Kit. So, Ferenc?
I will not address your debate with John. Why? Because I'm conservative. And I don't think that I have got the universal clue in my pocket. But I would like to address Danny's question about the youth and the problem with how to belong for our youth. And I think that's crucial in an important sense. And it's connected, I guess, to the issue of localism that Dan brought up. So I would like to bring here an example, because I agree with you that we have to get back on ground and forget these nice universal principles. And what is the basic example that I would like to bring here is a Hungarian example. if in Budapest. Let's see how did it work. It was in 2002 when the first Orban government lost its power. It was just 2 or 3% difference, so it was just a small difference. Yet it was a crucial event, and it was a feeling of tragic loss. That they were working for 4 years, they achieved a lot, and then they lost. What's happening, and what should be done? And the idea was that the party is not embedded into society. Why? Because society was destroyed by communism. We were in 2002. Just 12 years after the transition. And the communist strategy was to destroy civil society, because that's the way to control society. You don't have the small groups, the local communities. You destroy it, and they did it very powerfully and very directly. So, and nobody actually thought that, well, if we have a transition, we want a liberal, democratic, parliamentary, whatever society. We need a civil society, and we have to be, we have to do something about it to achieve it, because it will not come out of the blue. So the idea was in 2002 that we need to embed ourselves into society, and we need civil society. How to do that? That's a political agenda. So you had to handle it politically. So what they did was to create what they called civil circles, which was a network of neighborhoods, of friendly gatherings, of clubs. They came together, and they were organized by someone out of the lost party, but someone who was embedded into this political context. He was responsible to try to build up the network. And it worked. There were, friendly societies, and they organized meetings and lecture series, whatever. They wanted nice films about whatever, cultural events, all that sort of thing. And it did not achieve success in 2006, but it did help by 2010. So it was 8 years of work, groundwork, grassroots work, directly addressed by the political party, that this is the job that we need to do. Because the communists were so much embedded into their own network. That was not society, it was their own network. But we need civil society to rely on. And that worked. The problem, however, because we are not at the end of the story, because you want the youth to be, to belong and to have communities. And I think there Fidesz is still missing the clue. I think that's because they should address it directly against as a political agenda, as the Butler example showed us, that you need a direct political agenda to build up that sort of a local youth culture, so to say. It's a difficult job, but it's a political task, I would say, which cannot be handled, directly politically. But if it's not if it's not on the political agenda, it will not come out of the blue. So I think that's the lesson that I think can be learned from the Hungarian example.
Thank you very much, Ferenc. Thank you.
It's a cultural product. It sells well. It's enjoyable, but it did not solve the problem. That's a political problem. You have to address it politically, I would say.
Let's have Dan and then Kit. And if you have another question, now is the time to raise your hand. Sir, I've got you.
Thank you. Ferenc has touched on my question already, but the question is this, that if we take Eric Hoffman's premise seriously, that it's all about culture now, and economics is marginal, which is a big move from where we were in the 70s and 80s, where it was most paramount. First of all, that means the divisions between, have your view on this, the divisions between Thatcherites and post-liberals or one nation conservatives doesn't mean very much if it does. If that's true, the other point is that if culture is paramount, what role of the state is there? When does the government need to start saying to cultural institutions that be more prescriptive and have conservative ends? We're funding cultural institutions, but they're not having conservative ends, they're having progressive ends. So what's the role in the state to underpin culture, if there is one?
Okay, I think what I'll do is take the questions in line and then have the panel answer them. Thank you very much, Dan. Kit?
Thanks very much. So I guess a very quick comment to begin with, which is, in order to have belonging, you have to have a place in which to belong. And for me, the fundamental problem with young people not being engaged in their local communities and the civic societies, civic institutions in which they're around, is they don't own homes, they're not tied to places. And I think that also connects with a slight worry I have with a kind of discussion about empire and civilization, is what was so wonderful about Red Toryism and Blue Labourism was its connection to place and to locality and to the specific and granular. And how do you maintain that at the same time as talking in these rather grand ways? The slightly, my other question is, as I kind of tried to allude to in my paper, we have been in some of these debates before. The idea that there is liberalism has gone too far, that liberalism is leading to authoritarianism, that instead we need to create an alternative to liberalism through a new politics of the common good, rooted in Christianity perhaps, was a pretty common position. Well, not common, but it had a strong intellectual basis. People like T.S. Eliot, Middleton Murray, Niebuhr. So it was there. So I guess why this time? Why do you think what's going to be different now than then?
Superb questions, thank you. And the last one, gentleman there.
Yeah, I just have a quick pragmatic question. If any of us have spent time in South Korea or in Israel, there's a cohesiveness to those societies that comes from the fact that 19-year-olds spend a year of universal service, military service. And I just wonder if maybe a lot of the boxes that you are looking to have checked would be served by creating such a thing.
Thank you very much. Okay, John, would you like to, you don't have to answer them all, choose a question as a response.
Yeah, I think we did have a successful cultural policy under Mrs. Thatcher. We won the Falklands War. That was a cultural event as well as a foreign policy event. That was also true to a lesser degree of the Cold War, much more important war, of course, but a collective victory, and one she played a particularly important role in, but nonetheless, but that was all helpful. But the Falklands War was, I think, did revive a patriotic feeling, certainly for a while. What was your question?
Is there a role of the state regarding upholding culture, if there is one? What should it be?
Well, the answer to that, I think, is I'm an Anglo-Saxon, and therefore I'm never very comfortable with this idea of a Ministry of Culture and the rest of it. On the other hand, we have a Ministry of Culture, and it is, as someone has said, devoted to progressive rather than conservative and patriotic. Well, you said it, I think, patriotic ends, and that's something I'm even more opposed to. So I think if we either abandon this altogether, or I think the correct thing to do is to ensure that there is a conservative Ministry of Culture, or there is a department in the Ministry of Culture which is on the Tory side. We had a recent fellow here, Jeremy Carl from Claremont, and he went to the opera here and was so impressed by it that he went back and did some research into the arts funding, and he discovered that the government here had significantly increased funding for the arts from the word go. They weren't running a political campaign, so to speak, but they were doing what I was suggesting. They didn't just simply fund hostile, transgressive art of various kinds. And the result has been in the theatre that there's audiences have gone up dramatically. And I go to the theatre here, admittedly not very often because I don't speak the language in which the plays are presented, but I went this week to see a Woody Allen musical, actually, marvelously done, in a different kind of musical, very cabaret about 3 weeks ago. Theatrical standards very high, tremendous theatre full, tremendous enthusiasm on the part of the audience. And I think that there's a whole range of things of that kind are occurring. And I think we should certainly now in Britain turn our attention to changing the personnel of these organizations and encouraging such things as occur as GB News. There ought to be a way of finding a way to help GB News, getting ministers to give interviews to them and that kind of thing. So that would be my main point. I've forgotten the other question. Was
it's okay, we can move on. Danny?
So we do have a Conservative minister at the Culture Department in Nadine Dorries.
Yes.
He's hardly a sort of wilting progressive. But the issue is that most government support for the arts is distributed from an arm's length body who are sort of, as it were, operationally independent of government. But there is a funding arrangement, and as I understand it, the government and Nadine are keen to ensure that that funding is allocated not exclusively to transgressive artists. So let's wait and see on that. I mean, I think the way, Dan, that the state should be acting on the culture is partly by these sorts of mechanisms, openly insisting on genuine diversity in output. Ofcom plays a role in that in terms of broadcast media, which is really important, and by insisting on freedom of speech, and that's what the university's Higher Education Academic Freedom Bill is going to do, and by using as it were, the bully pulpit of politics of Westminster, of the House of Commons, number 10, to articulate the culture and to stand up proudly for our inheritance and our values. Kit's question about why now? I mean, well, in a sense, I mean, you're more an expert than me, but I mean, Butler's efforts paid off to a degree. There was in the post-war era, given the trauma socially and intellectually of the interwar period, the post-war period was a lot more stable and culturally conservative for a generation or two. And although the sort of intellectual horrors of the 60s have had their consequence, the sort of cultural momentum of the 40s carried through up until probably the 1980s. And so I don't think that the search for a conservative idea that we saw in that period didn't have its effect. It did. It's been undermined by the cultural forces of liberalism, social and economic, in recent decades, and now it falls to us again to revive a cultural conservatism, and I think it will work now because it has to. As we've been discussing, there isn't. I mean, there's a lot of ruin in a nation, and ultimately we might all fall apart. But there is the nature of things is such that I believe that truth will right itself again, and as long as we can avoid the total catastrophe, which does threaten us in all sorts of forms, then culturally we will recover as well. And if not the millennials, the post-millennials, or the post-millennials, will see sense and repudiate the nonsense, and there will be revival, as there is. I mean, there is Christian revival happening around the world, and what's going on in China is the great story of our times in many ways. And I think the same will happen for cultural conservatism, that good sense will out again, but it won't happen on its own. So that is the job of all of us.
To speak to Kit's point, what defends the most particular, what defends the granular, is not the granular and is not the particular. I mentioned earlier in the day, God, it feels like we've been here for 2 days or 3, doesn't it? That Romans decentralized through honor. So what they did is they created forms of local government where you gave honor to those who looked after your commune, if you will. And that honor was universal and shared because it was created at the center for this is how you ought to act as a Roman in regard to that which you have power over. The same is true in Britain with the notion of the landlord and the duties of the lord. If I recall, if you look at what happened with the Star Chamber and the monarch, so the monarch essentially empowered the peasantry in Britain against the landowning class. And there's a long history of that. And so therefore, then you have the universal at the center empowering the granular against monopoly and oligarchical capture. And think of the Primrose League, which you will know well. So it's just a mistake to think that those who value place can't do universalism as well. Nothing was more popular in Britain than the empire. And yet when they went to defend, they thought they were defending their places. So I think that what is interesting is that there isn't a dichotomy between universalism and particularity. And what I'm arguing for is exactly that. I argue that you can't defend difference without a certain understanding of universality. And if you just try to defend difference, you set up a monstrous form of universality that makes everybody adopt the difference you defend, which is kind of the logic of kind of woke identity politics. And so it's the character of that universality that we should discuss as post-liberals. And what we would argue for would be much more liberating of difference than liberalism, because liberalism has become repressive. I contend that's in the logic, the inner logic of liberalism itself. I even view things like fascism as a direct outgrowth of the liberal project, because fascism is a philosophy of power where there are no constraints. And you can read that directly. I think it was the Hungarian writer who's written brilliantly at this, Oriol, the Hungarian theorist who's written brilliantly on the link between liberalism and fascism. So that would be my point, and that's what I want to defend. So only universalism can defend difference is my point. So thank you very much, everybody. Let's go celebrate, be friends, be collegiate. Thank you.